Okay, a little note on some upcoming stuff. Board Game Arena has 3 new Hex and Counter war games in development. None of them are inherently as good as Unconditional Surrender, but I've said this before, it's the community rather than the game that makes the play experience. Memoir 44 is being developed by one team, Talon and SE4X at the same time by the same developer, Lunanol, who was also responsible for Unconditional Surrender. All look like they'll be interesting. Memoir 44 has a very large playing community already, and actually a literature on strategy and tactics, so that one will be worth looking at. But I'm not going to look at any of them until they're out of the alpha and beta stages of development. In the league, I currently have 3 games underway, and this episode will be looking at 2 of them, in both of which I'm playing the Axes. That's because sort of Kahu was playing quite slowly, and so there isn't actually a lot to report in that game. We'll begin with my game against Gamerdad, which was an East First opening. Remember, in an East First, the USSR is attacked, and if things go to plan, conquered in 1940. And then France is attacked in 1941. The invasion of France is just beginning in this game. And just before the invasion, Sweden activates as a Soviet power, adding to Finland and Portugal. That was not fun. I moved in June, having already taken Netherlands and Belgium out of the war in May. Very simple thing that you always do in the East First game. You declare war on Netherlands and Belgium before the Soviets collapse so that they activate as Soviet powers. Nothing fancy. I'm aiming for smashing through in the north here. I am down 1 panzer due to covering the Swedish entry, but I will hold back my surprise marker. I may need it in Scandinavia, and also I'd like to potentially hold on to it for a Sealion if possible. I've talked about this before. I do not like the solid line defence. I've marked the French unit that makes up that solid line defence, and generally speaking I prefer to have a British unit holding Lille. The solid line creates a weakness between Lille and Sedan, which allows me to attack in open ground. Minor note, it never makes sense to abandon the Maginot line, as has been done here, and certainly not those forts which are defending cities, which are the 2nd and 4th forts in the line. You could, in theory, abandon the other 2 and defend Dijon with a single unit, but I doubt the gain of troops would be worth it. Once the panzer forces its way through the gap between Lille and Sedan, Sedan loses its retreat and I begin to attack there. After taking Sedan, I make another poke at the 8th Infantry in the open and get a DD result. A little puzzle for you. Where should the 8th Infantry retreat to? There are 3 options here, and remember I did a video before on retreat paths and how they can occasionally be trickier than they look. Take a few moments and decide for yourself which one you would take. So, if it retreats to Paris, then the next panzer can simply walk through to Dijon. And the same applies if it retreats to the southwest. If that happens, the French defence has functionally collapsed. It's probably fairly doomed as it is, but the only real option here is to retreat southeast, which sets up a line of zone of control that prevents exploitation. These are the sorts of small decisions which separate the weaker and stronger players in the USE League. Overall, I had a pretty successful attack in June. I forced a retreat on the Italian fronts. I used it to connect a supply route without having to take Calais from the UK. German units have taken most of northern France. No success on the Spanish border or against Gibraltar, but Turkish forces were largely unopposed, so I steamrolled through Syria. The British position in Africa is now unhinged. The French have 10 national will. Remember, they start with 10 more national will when you're playing in an East First game because the Soviets have already activated. They'd have collapsed completely in a regular game. And I have 5 cities within reach of my forces, so collapsing them in July is now nearly a certainty, and since I've not used that surprise marker, I can make a Sealion effort if I wish to. Against Sweden, I took Malmo and destroyed one unit, but that was all I achieved up there. Okay, this is an important point on the diplomacy. When France or Russia collapse, you get both an unlimited political success and a pro-Axis marker in the diplomacy cup. Because the Axis player goes first in each phase, they get to draw first, which means if the cup was empty, the Axis now get a guaranteed activation anywhere on the map, as long as they remember to save 5 production points. In this case, the unlimited success from the conquest places a marker in Ireland, and the draw activates Ireland. This will allow the Axis to seize an undefended Dublin and land troops without the need to actually play a surprise marker. I will be playing the surprise marker as well. If Gibraltar falls, Italian assets can be brought to bear for the invasion of the UK. Note, it's not worth sacrificing your continuation against the Soviets to attack the UK, but it is absolutely worth a quick collapse if you can achieve it. I make a silly mistake here in the Middle East. The Allied player has a naval evacuation counter, so in this situation the Turkish 2nd Infantry should have simply moved directly to Port Said and left Haifa to following units. The British unit will, following the DR result, use the naval evacuation and occupy Said, so there's now a defensive line in place. Like I say, just a silly mistake. No luck against Gibraltar. So, by the start of September, I am running 4 separate theatres, creating a mutual overstretch with the Allied player. The British do not have the production points to act everywhere, and they only have 1 tank counter. However, the German landing in the UK is tenuous. They really need support from the Italians, and that cannot come until Gibraltar falls, and Gibraltar is still very much holding. The UK still has 13 national will, with 6 being at stake overseas. And time is beginning to press. The Soviets will re-enter the war in just 4 months, and I need to begin the transfer of forces to an Eastern Front for a continuation. I don't need everything to be there in December, but I do need everything to be there before the fair weather offensive starts. I get lucky. I start my attacks around Egypt, and Gamerdad plays the British tank counter, which he should not have done. This means my first assault on Gibraltar has only a 1 in 9 chance of failing. I don't spend the German tank marker because it won't shift the odds, but hold it back for a second attack with the lone German infantry left surrounding the outpost. Which is a good thing. I roll a 2-6, the assault fails, but the next attack gets in and Gibraltar falls. I take London and then land additional troops in Belfast, Southampton and London. The unit in Belfast doesn't need to be a German one. The UK defence is so thin, all I need is for the unit to walk across and seize Glasgow and Edinburgh. There is nothing the UK can do about it at this stage, even with poor weather. I didn't make much progress anywhere else, but Kuwait is going to fall next turn. In fact, everything in the Middle East is going to fall when the UK collapses, because that causes all of the fleets and aircraft to disappear and everything to take a step loss. And at this point here, Gamerdad offers a resignation. I understand why he wants to resign at this point. He's having difficulty keeping up with the league games in general. I would say that this is almost certainly a lost position. I'm going to be able to get complete medlock. I've occupied the UK. I'm going to be in time to transfer my units back to the east so that I can continue with continuation against the Soviets. And given the respective play up to this point, I'm going to be very confident of succeeding on that continuation. The downside for offering a resignation in the league game is it hurts your tiebreaker. In this case, I'm going to get a 126 point national will differential. That's not quite the best differential in the league. WKSP got a 130 from a similar resignation, but it's way better than any endgame position I could hope for. My game against Sotokahu has not ended. As I said, he's not playing terribly quickly, though with the collapse of the USSR, I'm expecting Sotokahu to win that. The League was at the beginning organised into 2 groups based on geographic location, which is not an unreasonable way to proceed, though it does mean the US players ended much earlier than the rest of the world. At this point, there are a dozen results in, 7 Axis wins and 6 Allied wins. Leagues are great for collecting data on the results of games amongst players. For example, you can collect data on the margin of victory, assuming everyone recorded it. There's 2 ways to measure the margin of victory. For the Axis powers, you measure how much national will that they have at the end of the game for all the countries that make up the Axis faction. It's not much data to say with at the moment, and it's heavily skewed by resignation. Resignation gives a very lopsided result. For the Allies, you can measure it by when the Allies score their victory, how long before the end of the game. It's also possible to gather a bit of data from the League on openings. One of the games seems to have been misplayed, so it's hard to assign an opening, but it looks like we've got 7 historical openings, by far the most popular, with an even split at the moment of 3 and 3. East First is the next most popular, 3 games, all of which went to the Axis. I don't think that indicates any particular strength in the opening, simply that East First openings in this round were played by stronger players. No long openings, and 1 short opening, which seems to have resulted in a timeout. 2 games apparently featured a Western activation of Italy, and 3, including the one we've just finished looking at, resulted in a Sealion. Like I said, it's not a particularly big data set, but I'll keep adding to it as more League rounds are played. So now I'm down to just 2 games. Let's check in on my second round long opening against Rondom. A landing in Norway. We are now firmly into the mid part of the long game, and the key for the Western powers is to draw some attention away from Russia. I have to fight a full summer against the Soviets before the end game proper, and I would rather do it without expending resources against the Western allies. The allies spend both the US and the UK marker to execute landings, Bergen and Stavanger. Let's talk a little about Norway. The Allies cannot muster a full-scale landing until the bulk of American forces arrive, which in the long game is in 1945. At this stage, they only have 4 full-strength units, and that would be swamped on a wide front, which rules out both Spain and France as landing points. They need an overseas area to attack, where the Axis forces are also restricted in their deployment. In a med-lock, there are essentially 4 options. Suez or Kuwait, from the Indian Ocean, French North Africa, the historical Operation Torch, which can be executed both from Plymouth and from the North Atlantic Box, and Norway, the choice that's made here. These landings have different effects. Suez and Kuwait remove major strategic warfare bonuses for the Germans and ultimately threaten the landing in Italy. The advantage of Suez is that it always has fair weather, so there's less chance of being bogged down on the beaches. The disadvantage is you're immediately facing enemies on 2 sides, so it requires a bigger commitment of troops. French North Africa removes the Italian fleet from its key strategic position threatening the UK, a major issue in a med-lock, and threatens an advance into and through Spain later in the game. On the other hand, it is the weakest of the landings because of the German ability to defend using the Luftwaffe from Spain. Norway threatens Swedish and Finnish German allies, and if the Western faction can establish uncontested control of Scandinavia, that gives them a substantial strategic warfare bonus and the potential for a landing into Germany itself. I had some good fortune. The landing at Stavanger bounced. The key to any Norwegian campaign is Hex 1523. If the Allies control this, they link the 4 Norwegian ports and can sustain 8 Allied units ashore. Axis control it, then it splits any Allied landings and allows the Luftwaffe operating out of Denmark to gradually pick off the landing points one at a time. The key to a landing in Norway is supply. And in order to maintain your supply, you have to cycle. If you leave a convoy or escort with 3 or 4 sorties on them, then in the next turn, the Luftwaffe will attack those reduce them to no sorties, and you won't be able to use them to get supply in. And worse, because they can't move, you won't be able to send another fleet and convoy in to provide supply. The solution to that is, after the initial invasion force has given supply to the units on the ground, you voluntarily eliminate it. That frees the port up. The port can't be attacked on the German turn because there are no allied fleets or convoys in it. And that technique, that cycling technique, while it's very expensive in production points, is absolutely essential to establish a beachhead when there is significant Axis air power available to counter it. You also need to know about this rule, carrier strikes. It's particularly important in Norway. As you can see, Luftwaffe units cannot support the defence without being on the coast, and if a surprise attack marker is in the sea zone, any carrier group can make airstrikes against any coastal unit. To make a point I've made before about poor rules writing, the BGA implementation allows you to attack multiple targets, but the rules itself are ambiguous, and I'm not sure if that is intended or if you should only be able to attack one target with the airstrike. In any case, you want to use this often. So when you do the initial surprise landing, the aircraft carriers should be hitting Stavanger to wipe out the Luftwaffe unit there. Then, on a subsequent turn, remember the US counter will come back in 4 turns, you should just put a counter into C-Zone 12 and hit every Axis unit that's in C-Zone 12 to diminish those. Rondom fails to cycle or use the carrier strikes. The 2 Luftwaffe units cut the supply and the American task force will be pushed back into Bergen, isolated and destroyed, causing the Norway landings to fail. There was no delay in Russian re-entry. I have to use my strategic move when the Russians re-enter, cover Helsinki, because the Soviets have a surprise attack marker and a convoy up in Leningrad. They can take Finland out with a single amphibious landing if I don't. I lose a few units and the Soviets push me back in the south over the winter, but I spend the time re-establishing air superiority and building up for a summer offensive. Note the Soviet fighters here are exhausted and my fighters are only on 2 sorties. Summer 44 is a critical moment in the long opening. In return for all of the advantages, guaranteed Soviet collapse, a much easier opening, a good chance of a medlock, a stronger endgame, you have to sustain an extra summer offensive from the Soviets. You don't really want to retreat from that, so ideally you counterpunch. You take advantage of the lack of Western forces and concentrate panzers and other units in the east. In this case, I countered in the north around Veliki Luki and south of Kharkov, and I spent air support in abundance. 5 fighters, exhausted, and close to 30 points of air support spent. The objective here is to kill Soviet units, not gain ground, just kill Soviet units. And the magic number is 6. Doesn't matter what type of units. In my experience, 6 thins the line enough to make it hard for the Soviets to maintain an offensive. Fall short of that and the Soviet counter will probably break through. In this case, I got 10. Again, I don't care about units. Note that what I'm primarily going for here are actually the weakest infantry units, and I'm ignoring the guard. That's because what I'm trying to do, Rondom gets unlucky with an attempt at a western landing, but ironically in this case they'd have been better off not using it at all. The mere threat of a landing was pinning 2 panzers down, both of which are now freed up for operations on the Eastern Front. The Soviets counter in the south and 2 of my units are trapped. They have to spread the line out simply to keep a line from north to south. I brought one of those panzers over that's now free from the west, and I need to think about how to continue this in the south. To me, the weak point is around the shock army. The Soviets cannot assign tank markers to shock armies, and its northern flank is protected by a weak original infantry unit. This will be a much better choice than attacking the knot of Soviet tanks around Kharkov. Having surrounded and destroyed the shock army, I turned my attention to the armour. I positioned the surprise marker I used to deal with the shock army so that it also encompasses the armour. The weak point here is the regular tank unit between the two guards. If it falls, the others are isolated. I have 11 attacks I can throw at it, so it should fall, and it does. I subsequently managed to destroy one of the guard tanks, but I don't take Kharkov. The weaknesses on the line shift constantly during an offensive like this, and you need to be flexible. Remember, it's all about killing units. You don't really want to gain that much ground because you don't want to become stretched thin yourself by passing beyond the Rostov-Leningrad line by very much. In this case, the weakness is around Bryansk. If the Soviets do not cover this with a strategic move, which they can, the Yugoslav unit west of Kursk can walk up and cut off the retreat of all three units there. Note those new forces at Tula, Ryazan and Moscow. The Soviets reel in the first month of a counterpunch, but they recover quickly and the German attack runs out of steam fast. Do not overextend yourself. The Soviets always have teeth in the late war. I am actually beginning to overextend myself here. The German unit Rzhev will be destroyed in the Soviet counterattack, but its loss will buy time to consolidate the rest of the line. The line's settled down by September, the German attack is out of steam, and I'm unwilling to push beyond this. And I have to start strategic moving panzers back to the French coast, as the Western forces will have their surprise attack markers back next turn, and that means the threat of another landing. I've achieved the last major strategic objective of the mid-game in a long opening. I'm going into poor weather on the Eastern Front, holding a line at or beyond, in this case 6 hexes beyond, the Moscow Treaty Line. I now need to focus on the endgame, and in the first part of the endgame, final summer offensive, there will be 2 strategic objectives: gracefully withdraw on the Eastern Front and repel or constrain an Allied landing in France. So I'll see you next time.